There are two ways to interact with skills in Last Epoch. The first is by putting them on your action bar. This allows you to use the skill and gain a lot of benefits. The second is by specializing the skill. When a skill is specialized, it unlocks a whole new tree, and this tree can be used to vastly change how it behaves. But okay, technically, there's a really interesting third way to get access to skills as well, and that's by proccing them. For example, in the current footage, I'm using the Dragon Song Bow and Harbinger of the Stars. This way, whenever I crit, there's a chance to summon a meteor. And as I'm critting, there's a chance to create a cone of fire. Proc builds are a staple in Last Epoch, and another example would be Smite Hammerden, a build that I've played before, where you use Hammer Throw to hit enemies a lot, triggering Smite, doing a lot of damage. Or alternatively, something like a Rune Master, where your Frost Claw can hit a lot, triggering Elemental Nova and inflicting a massive number of ignites on enemies. But when it comes to proc skills and proc builds, a question that I get asked a lot is, how are you using it without it being on your bar? So I'm going to go into this in just a little bit more detail. And if you want to know more about proc builds in Last Epoch, I'm about to play a proc-based Warlock, so do be sure to get subscribed and leave a like while you're down there. And for now, let's get into making skills magically appear without being on your bars. So now it's time for a little bit more of a practical example. Here I have my Falcon Bomber build. I have Explosive Trap, but when I use Explosive Trap, you see these Ballista appear. And the Ballista then explodes, but I don't have Ballista on my bar. This is because right here, there's a node called Siege Engineering. Whenever you use an Explosive Trap and it detonates, it has a chance to create a Ballista. This leads to me having Ballista be summoned without having to summon them myself and without having to have the skill on my bar. Because skills being on your bar does not actually matter for their functionality. Just like how you can have a skill specialized here, but not on your bar, you can also have a skill on your bar, like Shift, and not specialized. I have all the baseline benefits from Shift, and I can really put anything I want here. Now I have Puncture. I can use Puncture. I won't get any benefits from specializing it, unless I actually invest into that, since you're only allowed to specialize 5 skills, but I can do it. Now, unfortunately, there are a couple exceptions, one of which would be Falcon Strikes, or Falconry. You must have Falconry on your bar to use the Falcon, which means to use Dive Bomb at all, I have to have Falconry on my bar, taking up valuable space that could honestly be used for another utility skill. But hey, sometimes these are the sacrifices you make to do absurd damage. Now, this is far from the only way to get extra skills to proc. Some skills proc from items. Other skills proc from different skill trees. Just looking through here, another example would be Arrow Traps, where I could get Detonating Arrow to proc from my Explosive Trap. If I look through here, I believe Shift has another one. Yes, Sleight of Hand. You throw shurikens at nearby enemies after shifting. So I could specialize my Shift, use Sleight of Hand, and automatically cast shurikens. Since I'm automatically casting it, it doesn't need to be on my bars. That said, there's nothing stopping you from putting it on your bars, i.e., I can do this, and I can still just summon these, except for the fact that it completely destroys my mana. That brings me to something really important in regard to proc builds in Last Epoch. They are not consistent when it comes to mana costs. Some procs cost no mana at all. Some procs trigger the skill without paying its mana cost. A good example of this is Smite triggering off of Hammer Throw. Others trigger the skill with an increased mana cost, such as the Detonating Arrow from Explosive Trap. You can kind of think of this as a difficulty bar, because if your mana management is impossible, it doesn't really matter how much damage you do. And in fact, that's very much something which happens on Harbinger of the Stars. Meteor has a very, very high mana cost. Now, when you trigger something based on a skill tree, it's usually pretty clear if it costs mana or not. It'll say something like, pay 50%, pay 125%, pay 80% of the mana cost. Unfortunately, if you're not triggering something via a skill tree and instead using an item effect, I don't really have a hard and fast rule. I guess the answer would be test it out for yourself and adjust your mana accordingly. And if anyone's played a lot more proc builds than I have, and they do know of some sort of hard and fast rule that EHG uses, do be sure to let me know down in the comments below. There are also a variety of different triggering methods when it comes to these procs. Sometimes you can cast something on crit. You can cast something when you use a potion. You can cast something on hit, and you can even cast something when you use a different skill. Because there's a wide variety, this leads to a surprisingly diverse range of cast on something builds, and it's an archetype that I've enjoyed a lot in Path of Exile, so I'm very happy to see this in Last Epoch. It's really hard to beat the feeling of smoothness and consistent gameplay which you get from using a trigger build. You don't have to worry about the skill that does the most damage or has the best clear. No, you go with something that has really good mechanics. A great example of this is the Blast Rain Impact Trigger Explosive Trap setup that I'm using right here. Explosive Trap with Impact Trigger feels great. You fire at the edge of your screen and you have amazing damage projection. Plus the mana cost is absolutely manageable. Then you get all the damage from Explosive Ballista, which hits really hard, but normally hitting that hard is counteracted by it being clunky. Another example of this would be something like Smite Hammerden, where Hammer Throw and Spiral are very efficient. You fill the screen with hammers that persist for a long time, and then they hit enemies a lot. This is entirely viable as a build archetype, although it tends to lose out to something like Nova Hammerden. So instead, you add the Smite, and you kind of get the best of both worlds. Smite is a spell that's incredibly easy to scale and hits very hard, but self-casting it can be very clunky. I'm not saying there aren't builds for it. I know, you're probably going to list them all in the comments, but it's not nearly as easy as just going hammers. This also lets you ignore things like cast speed and invest into bonuses that might increase the damage at the cost of reducing the speed, or simply give you more stats to scale your damage directly. So as someone who's played a lot of trigger build and a lot of ARPGs, I'm really glad this is so well supported, and many of my favorite ARPG builds are in fact triggers. But what about you? Have you played any trigger builds in Path of Exile, Torchlight Infinite, or Last Epoch? And if so, what are your favorites? Put them down below. And hey, if you came here because you were just wondering, why is that thing working when it's not on someone's bar? Now you know, it's a trigger build. And if you're looking for some of the specifics on the character that I'm actually playing, do be sure to check out my full build guide, which released just the other day. I'll link to it up in the card and down below. And if you want to know more about trigger builds in Last Epoch, or maybe find one to play, then I'll link to the guides over at MaxwellGG that have a wide variety of triggers. But if you found this video helpful and want to see more like it, the best way to support is by becoming a patron or channel member. YouTube AdSense just isn't what it used to be. In fact, creating content on YouTube often means working extremely long hours for extremely low pay. And so, direct financial support not only provides much needed stability, but is also a great way to show that this is the kind of content you want to see more of. So with that said, thank you very much for the support. And also, thanks to everyone who watched to the end. A lot of my videos around the Last Epoch launch are a bit of a departure from my normal style. I've gone with something that's a little bit faster to make and a little bit easier to edit. Because a lot of the time, I get questions, and I'd love to answer them for everyone, but it takes a certain amount of time to make a video. So this format is much better suited for things like, and so I wanted to make a video format that's much better suited for answering questions like, how are you using a skill if it's not on your bar? I hope you learned something, and I'll see you again in the next one.